I'm going to call on the panel members to come to the stage. All of them, please. Francois. Thank you. That's it. I would like to welcome you all to this conversation this evening. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for being partners of not only Senwes but Nampo. It's great to be back here, and it's great to be part of this ongoing activity. You know, I used to say that in the old days when I was still in politics, I was not very welcome in this part of the country during the time of Nampo. But things have changed. And nowadays, people like me can also be part of the bigger farming community. So at least, for you as a newcomer, Sakele, I can say it's a happy landing. And I hope you're going to enjoy the evening. It might be your first time here. I hope you're going to enjoy the evening and the rest of the activities. So apologies for two names that appear on your programs. The first is DG Mpofu. Unfortunately, she was called for other urgent services today by the government and couldn't make it, but Sakele Madlozi is standing in for her from the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in Pretoria. And then our other panel member who is on the list but couldn't make it is Nick Serfontein, who unfortunately fell ill very seriously, I believe with pneumonia, and he had to excuse himself this evening. But welcome to the other colleagues who are here that are on the list. Our theme for the discussion this evening is agriculture as a global business, and I think it's very appropriate to start there, to talk about it as a global business. Maybe a little bit of background. Less than a year ago, some of us who are sitting here were very closely involved in establishing a project which is called the Public-Private Growth Initiative, PPGI for short. And when we started the whole discussion, firstly amongst private sector participants and later on then with government, the whole idea was to bring private sector and government together and closer than it was or used to be. And that emerged as a very close relationship now between the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in the presidency and different private sector groupings. The whole idea was to establish a direct interaction, sector by sector, with the government. And the interesting thing is that when we started to line up different sectors for this purpose, the first one was the automotive sector, for a very obvious reason, not only because of Toyota, but also because of the fact that the automotive industry has established over years a very well working relationship and partnership with government already. And that could be used as an example for others. But the second choice was the agricultural business, agricultural sector at large. And I was so happy that that emerged almost naturally, automatically. And I think this evening we can look back at a year of great discussions, great participation, where agriculture was in the forefront of this interaction with government. It's still an emerging initiative, we can say. We are not fully there yet, and Sakele will talk a little bit later about where we find ourselves now in terms of government planning for the way forward, including the agricultural sector. But with that background, I would like to start off, Francois, by asking you to give us an overview of where we stand. This afternoon, when we were driving from Pretoria, I said to Michelle, my wife, it looks better than last year. I have a feeling that the crops in the western part of the country are looking better than last year. I hope that's true. But maybe you can give us an overview of the current status.
So, Ruth, this year really tested our resolve. If you would have visited us in the middle of January, you would have seen almost absolute desperation. So maybe just a step back as we talk about global business. Of course, it starts with your local production. We have broadly about 34 main commodities, that is food and fiber, that we produce in South Africa. And of those, around about 22 of them are net exporters of that specific commodity, what we meet South Africa. Your direct question on the maize crop, the last 5 years were really a bumpy ride. It included one of the worst crops we ever had, and also the record crop we ever had. So just the last 3 years, quickly in perspective, if we talk maize, that is white and yellow, over 17 million tons 3 years ago, followed up by 12.6 million tons. And this year, the verdict is still out, but the last CEC number was 10.6 million tons. So yes, lower than last year, but at a point we really thought that 8.5 million tons were on the cards. It is maybe the season where I found that the supply market and the demand market were the furthest apart, and it's because of the lateness of the rains that came 6 to 8 weeks late, which of course impacted the hectareage. But the biggest impact is on what will happen with that crop, what will the yield be. And we slowly got the two sort of sides of that market came together. And I think we're at the point where it's generally accepted that we will be above the 10 million tons, somewhere in between 10 and 11 million tons. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and that's an important thing, the demand grew from below 10 million tons, sort of in the last 3 to 4 years, to at 11 million tons, which is not only reflective of our population numbers, but also of the diet that is shifting to more protein-based diet. So the demands are up. That's sort of the second thing. The last thing I want to end off with. If you look at our producers and their effectiveness, we're in the top 10%. If you measure them, how many kilograms they produce per millimeter natural rain that they receive, in excess of 12.5 kilogram per millimeter rain, and that is top class. So from a production point of view, and remember this is without any subsidies, or very, very low subsidies, below 1% subsidies, where you compare that with 30 to 40% subsidies from a European and American farmers. So from a production point of view, and from an effectiveness point of view, and ability, just the ability to produce under these erratic circumstances, our farmer sector and the rest of the value chain. Remember, it's never only one part of the value chain. It is the value chain, the competitiveness of the value chain as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview, Francois. John, you're looking on an ongoing basis at the total sector, agricultural sector, from where you are. Maybe you can just give us a little bit of insight in terms of your job, what you're doing, and then take it from there.
Yes, Rolf, thanks very much, and good evening to everybody. AGBIS, the Agricultural Business Chamber, has approximately 90 members. It ranges from different value chains, input suppliers through to integrated agribusinesses to the financing fraternity, that's the commercial banks, also DFIs from government, Land Bank and IDC, and then into processes. So it's all along the value chain, and it's across various value chains, whether it's grains, meats, wine, fruits, etc. So we play a bigger role. So our role is to engage government on policy and legislation. That's our key and core function. In other words, to create an enabling environment which will attract investment so that we can grow agriculture, we can grow food security, we can be competitive on the international stage so that we can grow South Africa in the process. So that is the core function of what we do. When Rolf walked into my office, I think it was in July last year, we set the process going which has been fantastic. And to get back to the topic of the day, where does South Africa stand in terms of agriculture in the global business sense? And Francois actually mentioned it. There are two key imperatives that we have to look at. And when we had the opportunity to present to President Ramaphosa, I think it was late in August last year, they said 15 minutes. You must sell agriculture in 15 minutes. And I thought, how do I do this? Fortunately, the president was so great. He asked 2 questions per slide. So he took us past an hour on that presentation because he's a farmer himself. He understands, he knows, he's so interested to understand what's happening in agriculture. And you'll remember that engagement that we had. And when he got up, he said, I'm excited. I'm as excited as Minister Dlamini Zuma. I want a 5-year plan. And this is where we got the whole process going. So what did we tell him? We told him there are 2 key imperatives. The first one is the competitiveness of South African agriculture, and that then you break down into the value chains, as Francois mentioned. And the second one is food security. Now, there are 2 different concepts to food security. There's national food security and there's household food security. Now, from a national food security perspective, and we've discussed this also with DPME, we're actually doing very well in the world. You can go and look at the Global Food Security Index from The Economist, and that Corteva also contributes. We rated, I think, 46th in the world, but we rated in the good category. Not the best, but definitely in the good category and definitely the best in Africa, partly because our food is affordable and our GDP is of a standard where most people can afford food for a decent living. The point is, though, that we have roughly 20%. It's actually a little bit higher. It has deteriorated lately. Because we've lost a lot of GDP growth. Our per capita GDP in dollars has come down. So we have gone backwards the last 7, 8, 9 years. Whether we like it or not, it's the truth. Go and look at the figures. The president is right. So we got to still address household food security. But from a national food security, because we're competitive, because we mostly export our food, we're a net exporter of our food is at export parity. That is equal or lower to the world price, and that gives people affordable food. So that's the huge bonus around competitiveness, is your affordability of your food. I'm just going to give you 1 or 2 quick figures. The last 2 years, 2017, 2018, our exports totaled over $10 billion US. Now you can multiply that by 14 to get to the figure of exports. So over $10 billion US were our exports. Our positive trade balance is in the region of just below $4 billion US. So we have a positive trade balance because of our competitiveness. Competitiveness, the definition is, what we use is the relative trade advantage. That's your ability to put your product on the international market at a price equal or lower than the international price and still make money. And that's where the efficiencies come in that Francois was referring to. We've got to be super efficient, but not just on production level, up and down the value chain, from your input supply, your logistics, your production, etc., right into the market. And this is where perhaps Lambert will come in, because if you're a net exporter, we've got to access markets. More than 1/3 of our income in agriculture is now derived from exports. So we've really got to work hard to access markets internationally, because we've got to compete with a whole lot of other countries. And this is where where the partnership with government is so important, to open those markets, to get support to make agriculture even better and to bring new entrants in. There are so many examples, I think we're going to touch on them tomorrow, around the public-private partnership, of how we then take agriculture forward, bringing new entrants in transformation as well. I think we can leave it there for the time being.
Thank you, John. Lambert, you are a trade lawyer.
That's right.
Now, what have you got to do with agriculture?
Well, thank you again for inviting me to share some thoughts from a regulatory point of view. So I leave the economy to the economists and the policy to the policymakers. But what we deal with as Hilton Lambert, we deal with agriculture for the past 15 years. Barriers to market access. Because you can have everything right at home, but you can't access the market. You must have a tradable product. You've got a tradable product. You've done your marketing. You've done your market intelligence. You've done your product quality. You secured your supply, security of supply. You looked at customer preferences, everything that you've done. But now you look at government to do the enabling role that they play in creating market access. Now, typically governments work all over the world. They deal with tariffs as the low-hanging fruit, because that you can cost into your pricing, you can negotiate over a table, and you can walk away and you can say, well, we've reduced duties, and everyone is doing it. But those are the less complicated, and it's not easy, as we see in the WTO, still Doha round, but the more complicated issues that's often left to resolve back home is to overcome your non-tariff barriers. And your non-tariff barriers are more opaque. And what we find dealing with various industries, the meat, the citrus, we all know about the citrus black spot issue, is they're facing market access in terms of animal or plant health standards. Now, immediately when we talk about those standards, we have to distinguish between public standards and private standards, right? You all know about the private standard, but let's talk about it. Public standards are those typically in those standard-setting bodies internationally where the South African government also participate, and which we should encourage participation in order to align standards to our level of development as well. But those are the International Plant Protection Convention, Codex, and those sort of institutions. They are usually science-based, rigorous, and they set the international standard. But often there's either no standard or a country decides to go beyond the international standards. So the acceptable level of risk is not on that level of the international standard. Then those need to be underpinned by best risk assessments and scientific evidence. Now, this is the issue that we need to speak to, is the capacity of industry to assist government in complying with foreign standards, but also rigorously interrogate foreign risk assessments that keeps us out of the market. The other issue is private standards. There we run into issues of consumer preference and concerns, sustainability issues. We recently heard about press releases in the UK in December, some premium or upmarket restaurants taking avocados from their menus, just because the water footprint on water-distressed countries of production, they don't like it, so they take it off. So you could have gone through the whole public standards, you'd comply, you face zero duties after Brexit, and there you go. They don't put your product on the market. So an awareness, and this is where you need to deal through your export councils with your importers on the other side, to be aware of the consumer sentiment. Animal welfare. The third issue is technical standards. And labeling is, for example, one of the issues that we deal with a lot. Whether it's GMO tolerance levels, whether it's maximum residue levels, whether it is animal welfare. Germany last week published the document, the draft legislation on voluntary animal welfare labeling. Okay, so every day we spend time looking through those notifications coming in, and they are abound on wheat flour, on maize, on soya, Uganda, pumping out all those standards. So if we say, do we equip the industry? Well, industry needs to be linked into where they get access. You don't want to be surprised with your consignment up in Mombasa and you face the GMO tolerance level that you weren't aware of. Those are practical issues. So where does it bring me? It tells me that these things are very complicated. Former what was his name? Foreign Affairs Secretary of the UK, Douglas Hurd, he once mentioned international trade is not a philosophy for the narrow-minded or the faint-hearted. And I wonder what he would say about Brexit now. But that's exactly why we're here. So how do you resolve these issues? There's no single producer on its own or her own that will overcome these barriers. And the importance of linking into producer organizations at various levels and forums is crucial. If we want to overcome these barriers, we need to cooperate with government, as we do in these value chain roundtables for meat, wine, vegetables, and fruit at the moment. I think that's about what we have going on. But we need to link in with trade associations. They need to be well-functioned, they need to be well-represented, and they need to be well-funded. Because in the cases that we have been dealing with, we've worked with associations that are not well-funded, so they cannot provide funding, grants for scholarships for students to study in science in order to build capacity in their associations to assist them in plant and animal health issues, to work with the Department of Agriculture. And that's really what I'm saying, is that we shouldn't let our associations go to ground. We are privileged in South Africa. We are well organized in agriculture. We shouldn't let that slip. I think I'll stop there. That's for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing that insight with us. I think it's very valuable. So Kelly, you are dealing with the farmers too, in a different way, at the Department of Planning and Monitoring and Evaluation. Can you give us an insight as to what we can expect in terms of the coming weeks as far as the installation of the new administration is concerned?
Thank you, Ruth. It's very interesting to be here today. Earlier on, when one think about farmers, one only think about food, not knowing where the food is coming from and how does that food ended up there. But besides that, there are a lot of things that are happening. One of those things that we can talk to here today. On the 8th of May, we had an election in South Africa. Those election was introducing the 6th administration of the democratic government of South Africa. And what is also interesting around that is the Nation in Conversation, as we are sitting here today, are having their 7th session of sitting, wherein they are talking about how government, private sector are coming together to look at the ways and means as to how they are going to go forward with collaborative efforts. But as part of the government initiative today, which is going to be coming into effect shortly, is to how to enhance those collaborations. But maybe one has to go back a little bit and indicate that from the 8th, what is going to happen next? The parties that were participating in the elections are going to submit their list of people that are going to represent them in the parliament. And those members that are going to be submitted are going to be sworn in as the cabinet members. And after that, those sworn in members are going to elect the president, which is going to be inaugurated on the 25th of May this year, 2019. And immediately after that, the president is going to now appoint his cabinet members that are going to be dealing with the policy issues that we have been talking to here, talking about the ways and means in which those different sectors are going to be made to be resilient to different issues that are confronting the nation today. But having said that, on the 12th of June, there will be Cabinet Lekgotla, wherein the newly elected members of the cabinet are going to be given some of the reports in terms of how the government has managed to work over the last 25 years. and the issues that have been picked up during those 25 years in order to come up with the ways and means to say, how are we going to face our 5 years to come, 10 years to come, as well as another 25 years that we are going to be faced as the country that is liberated. Maybe one has to invite the team here to say, after the 12, maybe it's going to be very wise for us to engage with the 25-year review. Because in that 25-year review, that is where we have outlined the challenges as they've been experienced by the different sectors, of which agricultural sector is one of them. And the PPGI has indicated about 14 sectors that are critical for economic development. There are specific recommendations that have been outlined in the 25-year review. Some of them include the critical challenge that face agriculture today. One of those is climate change issues. And whilst one travels across the Republic of South Africa, you see a change. For the last 5 years, there was a lot of challenges that faced the farmers in South Africa. Climate change was causing a lot of problems for them. Their export was challenged, but one has to indicate here to say agriculture, although they were faced with those climate change challenges, but they managed to save this economy. Maybe one has to indicate that agriculture was the only sector that was having a positive GDP in this country. John is going to confess to that. And at the same time, agriculture managed to keep their export figures not dropping despite those challenges. Despite the issue of climate change, the issue of financing the initiatives in agriculture becomes a critical challenge that the upcoming administration is going to face with. That is going to look at how the smallholder farmers are going to be assisted to be part of the bigger players in the agricultural sector. And I heard Rolf was saying earlier on, by the time he was coming here for the first time, it was very difficult. But I hope by now it is easy and you are here, then I'm feeling very comfortable whilst you are here. The challenge of financing of the agriculture is going to be one of the apex priorities. And it is of the greatest belief that the PPGI is going to assist in ensuring that the financing modalities are going to be ironed out going forward to ensure that agriculture is resilient to different challenges as we are facing. I've spoken about the climate change, I've spoken about the financing modalities that are there. The other area of concern is around how do we now build agriculture that is going to ensure that the security of supply for the products that we are having is going to be resilient to ensure that the trade requirements, the standards that has been mentioned earlier on are going to be overcome and say, how are we using those standards to enable our agricultural sector to be a global player, and not just a global player, but one of the leading global player in addressing those matters associated with standards and those barriers to trade. So having said that, the 25-year review is going to outline the priorities of this government on different sectors. Surely the agricultural priorities have been outlined in the form of the 5-year priorities, wherein those immediate challenges are going to be addressed with key steps and actions that needs to be taken up. But that is not going to be done only by the government only. The government is just creating an enabling environment for the business to do what they do best. One of the things that we have learned whilst interacting with the president of the country We were not aware that he was he's a farmer even today. When he's asking us questions about farming things, that is when we started now having that interest to say we need to learn more about how is this farming or how is this agriculture actually works. How could it be enhanced to ensure that it is contributing effectively to the well-being of everyone, including the food security, the access to food, and besides that, how are we using agriculture as a viable business through initiatives like development of agro-hubs, development of economic zones that are aligned to agricultural businesses in the country. I think I can pause there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're more switched on than ever before as far as this sector is concerned, despite the fact that we are not all farmers. John, we're talking about growth. During the last 2 days, we heard many advices going in the direction of the president on what he should do in this new term. And I think the president alluded to it many times during the campaign leading up to the elections, the need for South Africa to set in motion economic growth to solve our problems. And it's quite clear that agricultural sector can play a very important role in that. When you propose to the government the contribution that can be coming from the sector in terms of growth, percentage-wise, but also in terms of job creation, what are the actual statistics that we're looking at?
Yes, well, thanks very much. I think the President has on many occasions, and I was at one of the meetings in Pretoria that he spoke at too, emphasized agriculture absolutely and the whole value chain absolutely as a growth area for this country. Our pitch itself was that we can grow a lot more in agriculture if we can get a couple of things right, get policy certainty right, and this is around the land issue and water issues, etc., and even the trade agreements and so on. Second one is to get market access right, and we've expanded on that. And very important to bring more producers into the value chains, and especially black producers. We must understand that there's a lot of land that's also lying fallow in South Africa that we're not using optimally, and that we must develop and bring in hub and spoke models. Now there are a number of models that are already working very well. It's a pity Nick can't be here tonight because he's one of the great drivers of this initiative, bringing in black beef producers into his feedlots, and then he sells into the international market. So that's how they access high value. The other members of ours, Westphalia, they do 50% of the avocado exports. They've also got hub and spoke models. Sundays River Citrus is another example. And Konanani can tell us, but I think there are about 150 black producers already in citrus, and about 87, I think is the figure, or roughly half of them are already in the export market. Now this is what we've got to also develop further in this process. So it's got to be inclusive growth, but I think the opportunity for growth is really high in various commodities, and I think we're moving in the right direction. I think it's very encouraging to hear that there's going to be more financing support, especially for new entrants through blended finance models, etc., into the value chains and into the high value markets, because this is going to be key to growing stability and to growing the sector. But we've got to get confidence back in the sector, not just in the whole economy, but also in the sector. I think the President is moving in the right direction as far as that is concerned. Unfortunately, we've seen that our confidence has deteriorated and our investment levels in agriculture have come down. In fact, there's been no new greenfields investment actually in agriculture, except in some industries, but the other industries there's even disinvestment. But overall, it's been very flat. And we've got to turn confidence around so that we can get investment. You first got to get confidence right, then you get investment, then you get growth, then you get jobs. Jobs is a lag indicator. So it starts with confidence. And I think once we can get the policy certainty issues right, the investment will follow. I think there are so many companies, and you know that, when we looked at the projects in agriculture, I think we're probably 20 or 30 projects that people told us, just let's get the things right, then we're going to get the investment. And I think that is very heartening. So we know there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of investment that's going to come once we can stabilize everything.
I want to ask a question about access to local markets, but before we get to that, Francois, from your perspective, what are the main inhibitors that we would like to call on the state to make it easier for new entrants into the industry? In other words, how to become farmers, those that want.
So I think the first thing you have to appreciate is what government is now saying. I mean, for the last 9 to 10 years, business were almost considered as the enemy. Those of us who work closely in these sectors, we know that. We were excluded, we were never sort of given a chance to speak, and that has dramatically changed. I remember 2 months ago we had that business, the Busa meeting with the president. He flew in just back from Davos, and all the industry leaders were sitting there, and he had 17 members of his cabinet and his economic cluster with him. And he spoke to us for about an hour and a half. He spoke directly to us for 10 minutes, and the rest was, we saw how he spoke to his own cabinet ministers, how he said to them that the only way that we can get out of where we are is to grow the economy. And these are the people that are on a daily basis involved in business. So remove the inhibitors. And that's your question. What are those inhibitors? I think the first thing is exactly what we hear there. So a friendly environment between business, because the government has to set that environment, exactly what you said, that friendly and enabling environment, so that business will find a way. We've always found a way to use the opportunities that's given to us. That is the first thing. I think the second thing is we have to appreciate one of the things that was also said. In the last year and a half, when attending congresses and panels like this, there's always somebody who sort of bashes our financial sector. It's become popular. I think it is one of the biggest mistakes we make. You have to only visit some of the countries in Eastern Europe where there's not a developed and a well-functioning financial sector, where all the production factors are in place, yet they cannot access, they cannot produce. Me and one of my colleagues visited one of the Eastern European countries 2 years ago. They could plant wheat with 1.5 meters or 1 meter snow, have all that wonderful soils that you have in that area, but they cannot access the markets. Mm-hmm. It's because their financial sectors isn't developed. So it is one of the things that we really have to appreciate, is the standard of our financial sectors, the development. So that certainly is an enabling factor. Of course, the good that comes with the bad, the fact that there's no subsidy levels, have created an environment, enabling environment for our producers. So I think that is in place. The things that Lambert spoke about, I think those are the issues that we really have to now start thinking. Because the few things that he has spoken about, I can tell you that the level of understanding at a lot of the commodities are nowhere near that. It is not easy once you've produced to be competitive and to be sustainable in that area. So that certainly in trade terms, we need to up our game. We're not a major role player. So we have to be very good in our game. So I think those would be some of the most important factors.
But before you can become an exporter, you have to find a local market to take your products. And that is some of the complaints that we're hearing from local new producers. Lambert, would you like to respond to that?
Well, the only way I would respond to that would be, well, what we face is that you're trying to produce, but you face import competition. So if I talk to enablers, you have to create, we haven't got infant industry protection, the benefit of the BLE countries, Swaziland, Eswatini now, of infant industry protection. From day one, a small farmer needs to face competition in the South African market, whereas if you cross the Limpopo, then you're shielded by an infant industry duty in dairy or in wheat or in pasta or something. But when you're trying to create an industry and you face import competition, there needs to be either market price support in the form of, driving a wedge between your international price and your domestic price, as that's also classified as a subsidy under OECD terms, PSE support. So I would say that as much as you're export driven, when you look at imports, you need to provide the environment within the legislation and within your bound rates that you are allowed under the WTO to shield yourself, to nurture competition, and then as you grow, you drop your competition, becomes more competitive, and then you can hopefully export. That's about my contribution on local markets.
Thank you. Maybe we should come back to that, but before we do that, let's go to the audience and see if there are questions from the floor that you would like to put to the panel. Can I see any hands? Ivor. I didn't organize with him the question.
John, you a while ago, I heard you talking about China categorizing South Africa as on their list of 10 or so favorable countries to import agriculture products from. And I thought that's an important message that Agriculture South Africa should hear. Was that just a story, or was that true?
No, I think it's definitely true. The President mentioned it the other evening. And he said when he had engagements with the Premier of China, he said, but we've got a problem because we've got a negative trade balance with China. In other words, we import a lot more from China than what we export to China. And how can we get balance in our trade? And the Premier of China was very open to it. And he said, we'll come with proposal, and he said, well, agriculture is our first one. Now, we do export quite a bit to China in terms of wool and some products, but it's starting to open up a lot more, and Konanani will tell you this week was the first week that citrus went into China. That we also heard this week that the wool market and the hides and skins had opened for China. I think that came through today, actually. Then we've also heard that, so we're trying hard to access the Chinese market because there's a lot of scope, there's a lot of potential to do that. But we must also remember, and it comes back to Lambert's point, with China, they are very nervous about sanitary and phytosanitary issues because they've got African swine flu fever now. And it's decimating the pork industry, which is a huge industry. They import 100 million tons of soybeans just to feed pork and chicken, etc. So we must understand why they're sensitive around sanitary and phytosanitary issues. So China is an enormous market. We're the biggest exporter of macadamias in the world, and 97% of that goes into China. It's a market that we can't even satisfy. So there a lot of sugar being in the south coast of Natal being pulled out, and macadamia trees being planted. So the markets are going to shift because we can start accessing the big markets like China, to a certain degree India, the UAE, Middle East countries, rest of the Far East. If you look at our trade, very interesting over the last 20 years. Europe until 2009 was our biggest market, and that's our fruit and wines. But Europe went very flat. Then Africa, because of the supermarkets moving into Africa, what we call the supermarket phenomenon, Shoprite, Checkers, and Woolworths, well, the whole lot. Suddenly, Africa became our top market, but it plateaued off because then they started producing there. And so 50% of our agricultural exports still go into Africa. But the one that's growing steadily and strongly is into Asia.
And I hope the agricultural sector is one of the sectors that has been hit hard by AGOA earlier on, that is talking to agricultural product, which was putting your product as one of those prime products that have been negotiated at the global stages. But having listened to the comments around whether are they given equal weighting, the answer I won't have it with me, but I think John is going to indicate what is the weighting that is given to different sectors. Around the free trade, I think we need to look at the issue of free trade with a bit of a cautious here. Because having free trade does not necessarily mean that your product are going to have access to those markets. As we are speaking, we are quite aware that the South African traders, I'm not sure what is the right word, your Shoprite, your Checkers, they are entering the African markets. As they are entering the African markets, it means that they are now starting to localize the product that is sold in those markets, which in one way or the other tend to limit the movement of the agricultural product from here to those markets. So we need to be very careful out of that. But having said that, what is our position as the government around the free trade? Yes, the free trade has been signed off. The Department of Trade and Industry is working on that. They have signed a free trade with a SADC country, and they're working on the African one in terms of how are they going to link different corridors of the African continent development. So having said that, South Africa is committed in ensuring that there are free trade agreements that have been signed or ratified, and some of them have been done already. But they are having negative spin-off at some stages if it's not well managed or maintained. Thank you.
Thank you. John, you would like to add?
Yes, I think Kunanani's comments are very relevant. I think firstly on the issue of the free trade agreements, we must understand that agriculture in the past has not had a fair deal when it came to trade agreements, etc. Because agriculture was not seen as a major trade issue or a major exporter. Agricultural exports now are still, while they're significant in terms of $10 billion US, it's still about 8% of our total export. So we must still see it, and it's difficult because it's very diversified and you have a lot of issues in agriculture. But it's becoming a bigger and bigger play, it's becoming more relevant, and the President himself acknowledged that. So we've got to get into better space in terms of bringing agriculture into the trade agreements. We're very fortunate now in that the sense that trade agreements from private sector participation in trade agreements, the negotiation thereof takes place through Tesalico. Now Tesalico is the subcommittee for trade at NEDLAC, Trade and Industry Chamber. We sit there, in fact we're the convener for business there. It gives us access that we haven't had before to get agriculture far more proportionally involved in trade negotiations. Government did in many trade negotiations, and I can mention it, I've said this to the Minister himself. When we did the EPA negotiations, I believe that agriculture was not consulted sufficiently, not even remotely, to the extent now that they're redoing a package deal negotiation at the moment, and there's a dispute on the go around the EPA because we weren't consulted sufficiently. They started with a goer, then there was better consultation. Yes, we ran into some snags there, but I think that was much better negotiation. Now, with the Brexit issues and the African trade agreement, African continental trade agreement issues, the SADC trade agreement issues, the tripartite trade agreement issues, we are far more involved. In fact, we're even looking at the tariff lines, and they're involving us fully on these. So we've made a big shift, Konanani, to get agriculture heard on those. Whether we're going to get exactly what we want, I don't think so, because the free trade agreements that Peru, Chile, Australia have with China, we're not going to get free trade agreement with China, because then we open up for our textile industries and a lot of other industries that we also want to protect. But the problem is now you're exposed to tariffs, and tariffs make you uncompetitive, or you're not as competitive into those markets. But we must try and see if we can access through Shanghai. They've got a free trade market in Shanghai and some other areas, getting to some bilateral specific agreements with China around our agricultural issues. There are ways and means of dealing with it. We must just be innovative with government to get those done. But I fully agree and I fully appreciate your comments, because we've got to move stronger in that direction.
I'm just going to give this gentleman a chance, and then I'll get to you, Lambert.
Yeah, thank you. My question is not about trade, it's more about the post-settlement support. And what I've noticed in recent times is that the post-settlement support provided by government has been lacking, or not really in tune with what the sector needs. And if we listen to what we're talking about here, and meeting, whether it's local demand or sort of export demands, and the criteria that goes with it, I think the support to new farmers coming through and to farmers in general needs to be ramped up quite a bit. So my question is I'm not so sure that government will be placed to do that going forward, and how do we pull in the private sector to assist with that? And Francois mentioned that I think there's a greater willingness now to do that, but how do we put it together that the private sector plays a much greater role in that post-settlement support, and therefore bringing farmers up to speed far quicker and far more relevant in terms of the times that we live in?
Well, there is an initiative in that regard under development. Would you like to say something about
Yes,
that, John?
let me say something. It actually, Ruth should answer the question. What we're doing is, we can even say it's part of the PPGI, but what we've seen, John, that this is a major deficiency in agriculture development, and we must look at inclusivity and development, and also post-settlement support, etc. And it is so. Government have failed disastrously with post-settlement support. We've identified this in private sector, so we're busy with this initiative called the Agriculture Development Agency, ADA for short, where I think key role players in private sector are looking to put up basically an agency, and of which finance will be a major component, blended finance or soft loans, etc. Yeah. And we work with you. We've actually consulted with the banks also on this, to try and get a fund that private sector can control and really start moving with some of the big role players, like the agribusiness, like the Senvestors and the AFCRIs, etc., to really get development going. I think there's and I mentioned it just now, there's considerable potential, considerable opportunity to do just that. But we've got to get the financing and the post-settlement support to those farmers out there. It is a big deficiency. It is a big inhibitor.
Any more questions?
Just an advert, Wednesday that discussion will take place.
Okay.
Which I think we must
Yeah, in the Nation in Conversation. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I think.
Can I go back to... Oh, Sakeli.
Thanks. In fact,
Shall we make this the last round? I'm just checking the directors. Shall we make this the last round? We start with you, Sakeli.
in fact, I was going to look at the issue of post-settlement support here. The government has worked with different sectors. One of what the bigger initiative that we have done with agriculture was developing what we called agriculture pakisa. In that pakisa, the space was open, or the provision was made for the business to drive investment in ensuring that agriculture initiatives are supported, and they are working for both the investors as well as the beneficiaries of those investments. We might have failed at some stages because those projects are not gaining the momentum that we expected them to gain because of the investment from the private sector. And we are hoping that through the PPGI, there's a lot of flow of investment to ensure that those pakisas are made to be effective and deliver on what they were intended to deliver at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the issue of free trade agreements. I think there's a lot of work that can be done. Alignment between different industries. We need to align agricultural interest with non-agricultural interest. And then we need to align South African interest with our member states within SACU, because we're not negotiating as South Africa anymore. We're negotiating as SACU. So we might be very aggressive in offensive positions, want to go into a certain market, but some other country in SACU is very defensive, doesn't want to allow reciprocity. So what suggestion would be is to say that we've got these value chain round tables, as I've mentioned, for the fruit and the vegetables and the meat and the wine. I'm not aware of any others, but let's take those four. My understanding is each of those roundtables identify priority export markets, and then looking at, as I said, market access barriers and how to overcome that. But perhaps we could link the priority market acts and priority markets identified in the fruit and see how they overlap with the priority market access for veggies and for meat and for wine, if possible. But we need to try and align this. And then we need to go to non-agriculture, because if we look at what happened with India, negotiations started off in 2005, December. We still haven't signed an agreement with India because there's a disconnect between the interest of agriculture. There was, at some stage, at least 300 agricultural products of interest in that deal with India. But because there's not a lot of appetite, my understanding, with non-agricultural sectors, that deal is not brokered. So, and I think industry needs to give guidance with which markets we are signing free trade agreements with, because industry is the trader, not government. Okay, my last word on that.
Thank you. Thank you. It's pretty complicated.
It is.
John?
Yeah, thank you, Roof. Just to get back to the topic, agriculture, global business, where does South Africa stand? I think the point that we've been making strongly to government is that South African agriculture, or the whole value chain, is a massive asset that South Africa has, and it should be nurtured and cherished. I don't think people understand the real value that we have in terms of our competitiveness, our food security that we bring, the employment that we bring, the opportunity that we bring, and that potential can be enhanced. I think we're moving strongly in the right direction to exploit that potential, to bring more people into agriculture. So I'm very optimistic, given what we've done really the last year and the engagements that we've had with DPME, with various ministers. Francois was part of many of those meetings. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think the complicated work Lambert has set out there. But I think at least we're working now as definitely as a stronger team, and that we can start making the investments that we need in this country to turn it around. It's going to take hard work, and it's not going to come overnight. But I'm really optimistic that we're in a much better space than what we were. Yes, there's still risks, and those risks are going to stay there, and we've got to be competitive. We've got to understand what's happening in the global environment. That's why we go to places like IFAMA, the International Food and Agribusiness Management Association, and we're going to China this year, because we learn what's happening in their food systems, what's happening with e-commerce, Alibaba, how do they do their distribution of food. We've got to understand all those things, because it's going to come to South Africa. And then we've got to be in the right space to can adapt and drive our own efficiencies. But we're doing that. We're watching the world. We're working with the best in the world to ensure our competitiveness and our food security.
Francois, will you lastly touch on the question of population growth around the world? We see the projections in our continent, but also elsewhere. Can we meet that?
I think the phenomenon, Rolf, that it's sort of become common language that to project into 2030 and 2050 and then to start off to say that there's not enough food, I think it's a fallacy. There's enough food. But to access it and have it at the right places at the right point, that's the issue. From a production point of view and with technology, farmers worldwide has shown that they have the ability to produce. But to have it at the right point, and these are all the things that we're saying, to be competitive. John touched on a few of the issues. The one thing that he didn't say was the affordability of food in South Africa. That is a major thing for South Africans, that if you travel abroad, you realize that affordability is a huge issue for our population. So, yes, population, of course you have to keep track with that, but I think we have that ability from a production point of view. Infrastructure is enormously important, and part of that infrastructure, we just touched on research. We have an example here in this room where farmers has taken on that responsibility of research themselves because it was lacking. And funding is now the big issue to support that. So our whole value chains need to be funded and supported so that we can deliver the right products at the right markets.
Well, in conclusion, I would like to say that I think we have seen a meeting of minds. We've heard a meeting of minds amongst the panelists. But I think it's also indicative of what is going on around the agricultural debate in South Africa. And there's one thing that came to my mind very specifically from this discussion, but also others, is that agriculture can deliver in terms of growth, the economic growth for the country, creating jobs. And with the partnership idea that's underlying the PPGI project, I think we can see how government also can contribute with a commitment towards making agriculture one of the standing out sectors in our economy. I would like to thank the panel members for their participation, their willingness to be here. It might have not excited the audience as they might have thought because there's no difference of opinion. But thank you very much for your participation.
Thanks very much, Rolf. Thanks to all our panelists. You may depart the stage now because we've come to the end of the formalities of tonight. Before you go, just two very important reminders. We've got a fantastic little goodie bag for you, so please don't leave here without it. All our sponsors, yes, Lisa, you can take one. All our sponsors have contributed a little something. And then you've got a program on your, there was a program on your chair. Please take it with you, have a look at it. We're back live broadcasting tomorrow from Nampo at 10 o'clock. There's also a map of the whole Nampo terrain there, so if you need to find out where we are, just follow the signs on the map, and we'd love to see you there. If you can't make Nampo and you can't attend the Nation in Conversation discussions, just go onto the website, nationinconversation.co.za, and tune in live. So once again, you've been part of the Nation in Conversation media launch, and thank you so much for coming. And now we've got some fantastic food, so all you need to do now is to eat, drink, and network merrily. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Nation in Conversation, in proud partnership with Sembes, Bayer, Engine, Nedbank, AFGRI, Grain SA, and John Deere, in association with Hinterland and Isuzu.